the thing that for us is so important is to understand U.S. domination and control and interest in Honduras. And there's a straight line of history where the U.S. has interfered, controlled, overthrown governments, and dominated or attempted to dominate Honduras. This goes back to the banana industry at the turn of the century, when the U.S. companies overcame the British companies and founded the company. In Honduras, everyone talks about La Compañía, and that was the company that controlled Honduras and controlled the governments, and that was Standard and United Fruit companies. They've established Honduras as a military base, as an economic base for their interests since that time. In 1954, the U.S. used Honduras to launch the coup, the military aspect of the coup against Guatemala, against Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala. In the 1980s, the U.S. used Honduras as a military base against the revolutionary movements and insurgencies and to support the counter-revolution in Nicaragua. And this continues to today. On December 23rd, the U.S. recognized Juan Orlando Hernandez as the victor in the fraudulent elections, cementing, that's right, Boo is right, cementing his attempt to impose himself on the Honduran people. If the U.S. had not recognized Juan Orlando Hernandez, things would be looking quite different right now. Nonetheless, despite this U.S. domination and all these years of control and repression backed up by the U.S., the Honduran people have their own history of resistance. It goes to the Great Banana Strike of 1954, to the organizing of the teachers' unions, which made the streets of the capital tremble when they marched through their history demanding rights, up until about 2013 when the coup government was able to dismantle their struggle. The campesinos and the indigenous peoples who are in a state of permanent resistance, always, for control of their territories, for control of their land, against what has turned into a laboratory for neoliberal projects funded by the U.S., backed up by U.S. military, and that's Juan Orlando Hernandez's plan, is the complete privatization of the country, the concessions of, right now, more than 40% of the territory has been concessioned to mining companies, hydroelectric projects, mega agricultural projects that will displace the campesinos who have any land from their land, mega tourist projects that will displace the Garifuna people from their coastal lands. This is what's at stake for Juan Orlando Hernandez, and more importantly, this is what is at stake in this struggle for the U.S. government, and this is what is at stake for the Honduran people. I'm going to just give a little background on the Alianza and this whole electoral process, because it's a little complicated and it's good to understand. Back in around 2010, when Zelaya was able to negotiate his return to Honduras after the coup and a long, complicated series of political maneuvers, he put forward a plan for an electoral party. The resistance movement split over the question. There was not total agreement on going to any kind of electoral struggle for the 2013 election. That's where he was looking towards. The one group, especially the indigenous movements and other movements, the Movement for Dignity and Justice is another major organization that opposed the formation of this party. Nonetheless, the majority of the National Resistance Front voted in favor of it and went on to dedicate themselves to building the Libre Party, was what they called it, Libertad and Refoundation. They went to election in 2013 and they lost. There was fraud. But their margin of victory was small enough that the fraud was fairly smooth. There was militarization, there was repression, but it just kind of went through. There was really not the fight against it that we're seeing now because it wasn't such an obvious fraud. Then the Libre took stock of what they had done. and how to go forward more, because for the next election, Juan Orlando Hernandez announced that he would be running for re-election, which is not allowed in the Constitution of Honduras. But because he had been consolidating his executive power, so he controlled totally the Supreme Court, the Congress, the Electoral Council, he maneuvered his way to make it legal for him, although it's not legal. In that moment, things started to form up in Honduras, this grand alliance against dictatorship, because even people who were opposed to the electoral participation saw that they had to begin to unite to fight against the imposition of a dictatorship, that if Juan Orlando Hernandez was allowed to go unchallenged, that he would be president for life, and there would be an extreme military-dominated neoliberal dictatorship at the cost of everything for the people. So the Alianza came together when the left wing, represented by Libre in the electoral struggle, made an alliance with the Anti-Corruption Party, which was kind of center-right, but genuinely opposed to the extreme corruption that exists in Honduras. Juan Orlando's government and Pepe Lobo's government, the president before him, another coup president, had plundered the national health system, stolen the money, and put it in their own party's bank accounts. People died, 3,000 people died because there were no medicines, there were no doctors, there was no treatment in the hospitals after they broke Social Security, is what they call it. So people were opposed to the corruption. They started to negotiate an alliance and a program that would be against the dictatorship, against the re-election, and with a program of social benefits, not perhaps as visionary as some of the things Libre had put out, but one that would include land reform, that would include popular consultation with the indigenous people before concessions, that would include more democratic rights for women, for the gay community, etc. So this formed the basis of what became the Alianza de la Oposición, the Opposition Alliance, or also known as the Alianza en contra la Dictadura, the alliance against the dictatorship. And it was this alianza that chose Salvador Nasralla as their presidential candidate. He had been the head of the Anti-Corruption Party. He was a very, very popular sports announcer in Honduras, extremely popular. And he still talks like that, like he'll be talking and he says, "And now, my people, we have to go to the streets." So people like him. They chose him precisely because he's popular, because he had demonstrated a commitment to anti-corruption, and he has certainly fulfilled his commitment in spades. So he became the presidential candidate. Mel Zelaya became the political president of the Alianza and the strategic thinker of the Alianza. So their plan was to bring this broad alliance together and win the election by such an enormous margin that the inevitable fraud and repression would not be able to take it away. And they did that, actually. They won the election, we don't even know by how much, but even with the fraud, they were ahead by 5% when the first results were announced, which is amazing. That's when Juan Orlando's plan kind of came crashing around his ears, and he had to go to his own plan B. And his plan B, as he said himself to his party members, was, if they are going to go this way against me, they are going to see something they have, the likes of which they have never seen before. And that's what he's doing now, friends. So the computers crashed in the vote counting center. Very strange. They crashed for hours and hours and hours. Then they started recounting. Then all sorts of craziness started happening inside the voting center. And we heard this ourselves when we were in Honduras during the election from people who were inside counting votes, that things were crazy, that trucks were pulling up with ballot boxes, And the manifest would say 100 ballot boxes, and they would find 125 ballot boxes inside. So every kind of fraud. At the same time as they began to prepare the massive repression that we've been seeing since then. When it became clear that they were committing this massive fraud, the people took to the streets all over the entire country, on street corners, in the smallest village, blocking the Pan American Highway, and in Tegucigalpa, they massed. And Juan Orlando unleashed a repression that is greater than any repression that occurred in 2009 during the coup d'etat, a military coup d'etat. The strategy now, the Alianza had declared a permanent resistance. They have declared themselves to be basing their struggle on Article 3 of the Honduran Constitution, which I'm sure the Honduran Constitution was actually written by the US in 1981, and I'm sure this clause was directed at insurrectionary, revolutionary governments, but it says that the people have the right to rise in insurrection against any government that has imposed on them by force of arms or illegality. And I'm pretty sure in 1981 they were thinking like, you know, the one FMLN in El Salvador or something. But now the Alianza says we are in Article 3, we are in a civil insurrection, unarmed, and we do not recognize the legitimacy or the authority of Juan Orlando Hernandez. And that's their basis, that what they're hanging their legality on. Meanwhile, they have said that they will negotiate some kind of something, but only with an international mediator that they accept, and that it does not include recognizing Juan Orlando, allowing him to continue his next 4 years. Juan Orlando convened a dialogue of himself with himself and a couple of what they call pocket parties or suitcase parties, which are these little made-up parties that exist only to give a pretense of democracy. And so they're talking to each other. Meanwhile, they have increased the militarization in the country 20-fold from what it was in November. They are kicking in people's doors. They are pointing guns at people's heads. They are sending death squads that are dragging people out to disappear them, and their bodies are being found in ditches, especially in northern Honduras, which is the most rebellious region ever since 1954 in the banana strike. So today, this morning, it looked to me like thousands of people in Tegucigalpa were gathered, marching towards the imposition event, is what they're calling it, not the inauguration, but the imposition, when the military opened up with a quantity of tear gas like I've never seen, and I've seen quite a bit of tear gas in my day, against them. They regrouped, and they're still protesting. All over the country, people are blocking streets, highways, doing what they call plantons, which is like a picket line on the side, not actually cutting off traffic because of the repression, but standing on the side, and they're still being repressed. Now, what the Alianza, what the social movements are talking about is the path forward. And of the important social movements, I want to highlight COPIN, the Lenca Indigenous Organization, which was led by Berta Cáceres Flores, who was assassinated on March 2nd, 2016, because she was a visionary leader. She cannot be reduced to an environmentalist, to a feminist, to an activist. She was all of those things. And her vision is what is leading the indigenous peoples movements in Honduras as they face this new challenge. Likewise, the campesino movements are another group that's in permanent struggle. No matter who's in government, they're going to have to fight for land. And so they're a part of this new visionary thinking. And the people in the streets following the Alianza are now talking about the long-term struggle. And they were talking about this before the election. They have been preparing. They have put out everything in this last month, but they have also been preparing for a longer-term struggle. So it will be the same. We'll be facing the same challenge here. However today ends up, however this week ends up, There's going to continue to be a challenge for us to stop the U.S. from supporting and funding dictatorship and death in Honduras, and to support the solidarity movements in Honduras. And it's a new phase of the struggle. The toll for the resistance has been very high. At the end from November 26th till December 30th, there were more than 30 people dead, shot by military police. There were almost 1,100 people arrested. Now we're probably up to 40 or 45 people dead, and another probably 2,000 who have been arrested. Out of that, political prisoners are starting to appear. Of the people who are arrested, a certain percentage are being charged with things like terrorism, sedition, armed for carrying weapons, which were like, a bag of bricks or something. So now we're also going to be facing, and they're facing, a struggle to release political prisoners. But they have shown themselves to be determined to continue. And I think for us here, the challenge will be to look for the best way that we can walk with them on this journey and oppose our government's interference.
Most black people do not know that there are black people in Honduras. Most black people, black Americans, don't know of the Garifuna in Honduras. And the legacy, and that's part of the legacy of slavery, a part of the continued disconnect between who we are as a people. It's a part of the continuation of the erasure of our identity as Africans, and a part of the erasure of our connection to ourselves as global bodies and global citizens. So I think, there's an important direct connection between the diaspora that requires a harsher and more vigorous interrogation of the consequences of global slavery, and how, in order to address the issues of black subjugation in this country, we must connect to the struggles of other black people throughout the world and understand that our fights for liberation have to be internationalist, because our oppression was created as an international project. And in order to overturn the conditions that exist within the national construct of the United States, we must be able to understand how it came to be. What we're seeing in Honduras is a revamping and a reoccurrence of what happened massively a few decades ago. And we should be alarmed because it mirrors exactly what is happening here as well, with the privatization and increased rush and the historic closing of public schooling and the attempt to eradicate public schooling as we know it, is a project of neoliberalism. It is a part of the same exact project of implementing dictatorships and using Honduras and using other countries in Latin America and using other countries in Africa. We have to make the connection between U.S. invasion of Libya and the destabilization that is happening there, connected with the viciousness and the terror that is the neoliberalism global project. Fighting Rahm Emanuel and demanding that education is a human right and that he has no moral authority to destabilize our communities any more than he has, that is the same fight that is happening in Honduras right now, and that it's connected. And it's connected to a larger global project. We are part of the consequences of the terror of the project of American empire.
I come here on behalf of CTU, and I'm standing here to share the fact that we stand in strong solidarity with our brothers and sisters in Honduras, and we refuse to accept this man as president, and we support the insurrection, which is their constitutional right. And we will support them. And of course, we're always working tirelessly to find new ways to support them. If this repression continues to happen in Honduras, we're going to be facing a mass exodus of immigration. I personally am a child advocate of unaccompanied children who are currently detained in Chicago. Did you know there's about 15 detention centers that are low-key throughout the city? Did you know there are over 500 children from the ages of 6 months to 17 in these jails? And I've had the privilege of getting to know these young men, and I usually work with 12 to 17-year-old young men, several of whom have been from Honduras, and I've seen their fear. I've learned of their struggle and their reason to come here, and I worry that with this current persecution, this repression, this insurrection, it's going to get worse. And so we need to tell our U.S. government that you need to stop, because it's going to hurt. It's going to put all these kids' lives at risk. We also know that, like in many countries, the fact that these teachers are resisting, we could learn a lot from how they're resisting. They've had much power in what they've resisted. The fact that they've been able to close 200 roads, set up major marches throughout, we can learn from that, just like our Mexican brothers and teachers can learn from us. I had the privilege of visiting Mexico several times to hear about the struggles there, and one thing they told me that stuck to me was, we're always looking onto you to see what's happening to you, because we know that whatever they're doing to you will happen to us next. And at that time, it was 2012, and they had like, what are charters? And they're like, we look onto you because we know that with this neoliberal agenda, whatever happens to you is coming to us next, and we need to prepare for that. So it's the same thing with Honduras. We need to keep vigil, remain vigilant of what's happening, and recognize that, and always stand in solidarity and get active. So I'm really excited that all these people are here today.
I came into this not knowing a lot about Honduras, so this has been incredibly educational. I've read some, but to hear about, as a healthcare provider, a direct care provider, a nurse, that the dictator of Honduras stole millions from public hospitals to fund his own campaign really enrages me, because it makes me think that someone like him, and I'll make a parallel to Trump and other politicians here in the United States, have no regard whatsoever for ordinary people and what their basic needs are. The last thing I'll say is really about how inspiring it is in learning about Honduras, how central the struggle for universal health care is to their movement. And I think health care, as we know in this country, is one of the most important, if not the most important issue for many people in just the past year, and that around the struggle to defend the Affordable Care Act, people have raised that our healthcare system is broken and that we need something other. We need Medicare for all, which is about access for everyone regardless of what you can pay and what your earnings are. So I find that their discussion really in Honduras around this demand makes it even more important why we need to build links to actually push for those kinds of changes and actually win those demands, not only in this country, which would be a huge fight, and we require linking all the struggles of people who are talking here together, but also linking it to the struggle in Honduras and against the repressive dictatorship there. So I'll end with that. I don't want to take more time, but I really want to say that, you know, the specter of what we've been feeling as working people, ordinary people, marginalized people in this country, and the attacks of austerity are one side of the equation, but the other side of the equation is what we need to begin to build more of, which are the struggles that link things together, issues together, and that build a united solidarity that can actually press on our government to say, you need to get out of Honduras, stop funding Honduras, but also demands things that we need here in the United States, like access to health care, public schools, and everything else that we need. Thank you.
So I'm inviting everyone to please join us. We have a bunch of placards. You can choose one. Give it back to us at the end, please. We're going to take a minute so people can do whatever they need to do, and then we'll be leaving from in front. We're going to march down State Street and over to the Federal Plaza.
Kimberly vive! La lucha sigue! Y si Sovet vive! La lucha sigue!
On June 28, 2009, there was a military political coup in Honduras that overthrew the actually elected president, Mel Zelaya. And it was condemned by originally the Organization of American States, the EU, all sorts of international bodies, the UN, and human rights organizations around the world. However, in the U.S., Hillary Clinton very specifically dedicated herself to supporting the downfall of Mel Zelaya. And she bragged about this in her book that she published during the election campaign when she was running. She talked about that there was discussion about what to do, and that she did everything possible once Zelaya was overthrown to keep him out of the country, even when there was a move by the Organization of American States to negotiate his return to Honduras. President Obama at first issued a statement saying that this was a return to the dark days and was not acceptable, but very soon the entire administration supported the position of Hillary Clinton, which was to support the coup and to move forward to try and get a government that they felt would serve their own interests much better.